The first thing they do when you arrive at Forward Operating Base Kestrel is hand you a cot, a kind of laminated map of the surrounding grid, and a look that says we'll see how long you last. I got that look from 11 different men in the first 3 hours. The 12th was Sergeant Dale Hooker, who didn't look at me at all. He read my file, set it down, scratched the back of his neck like I was a math problem he'd already decided wasn't worth solving, and said, Specialist Rosalind Mercer. Designated marksman. Bravo element. He finally looked up. You TBH ever actually hit anything that shot back? I told him yes. He nodded like I'd said probably not. That was March. The Kandahar basin was doing the thing it does in early spring where it can't decide between freezing you to death at night, cooking you through by noon, so it just does both aggressively like it's a point to prove. The sand got into everything. Your socks, your rifle breech, the corners of your mouth when you talked. You stopped tasting food after the first week and started tasting geology. FOB Kestrel sat on the eastern lip of a dried riverbed, perched behind HESCO barriers and concertina wire, and it smelled permanently of diesel and burned garbage and the particular sweat of men who hadn't slept properly in months. There were 43 soldiers on base at any given rotation. I was the only woman. I was, I think, also the only person in Bravo element with red hair, which I wore in a braid, so tight it gave me a headache, tucked under my helmet, invisible. They found out about it anyway. Mercer's a redhead, someone said the third night like a verdict. No kidding, said someone else. I was cleaning my rifle 12 feet away. Well, I didn't look up. The rifle was an M110 Sonomatic sniper system, and I knew it the way you know something you've spent 1,000 hours with, not just the weight and the pull and the breath hold before the trigger, but the personality of it. The way it ran cold versus warm. The particular hitch in the bolt when dust got into the carrier group, and you had to run a patch through before it would seat clean. Mine had honestly a scratch on the stock from a range accident back at Fort Benning, a white diagonal line about 2 inches long that I traced with my thumb so many times I could close my eyes and find it. I'd qualified expert 3 consecutive cycles. Plus, my groupings at 600 meters were tighter than anyone in my company. My platoon commander, Lieutenant Vasquez, had namely requested a designated marksman for Bravo's Overwatch rotations, and after the request went up the chain, I was what came back down. Not everyone was happy about that math. His name was Corporal Brett Sarkey, and he made it his personal project. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way that gets you a formal complaint or a conversation with the command sergeant major. In the smaller way, which is harder to name and easier to survive and leaves less visible marks. He'd ask in a casual voice in front of the full element whether I'd practiced lately. He'd mention, to nobody in particular, that he'd heard female soldiers had trouble with the M110 at distance due to. He'd pause here, like he was being thoughtful, upper body mechanics. He'd hold doors just slightly too long when I was walking through them, which sounds like nothing, but isn't nothing, not when it's 3 times a day and the pause is just long enough to make the point. I learned early not to react. My mother had taught me that, actually, though not about soldiers, about a different kind of theater. You don't give the audience what they came for, and eventually they stop buying tickets. So I cleaned my rifle. I ran my 4 miles at 0-500. I hit my marks in every practice iteration. Sort of. I didn't complain. Plus, I didn't explain myself. I waited. The briefing came on a Thursday, and Captain Miriam Okafor, compact, precise, the kind of woman who delivered information the way a scalpel delivers cuts, spread the overlay on the table, and pointed at a cluster of buildings 2 kilometers northeast of our position. A compound, which 3 structures arranged in a rough L shape around a central courtyard, backing up against a ridgeline that gave the whole thing natural cover from the north. HVT has been using this as a transit point, she said. Mullah Farid Nasir, and he's responsible for coordinating 3 separate IED networks operating in the Argandab corridor. He moves every 48 to 72 hours. We have, I think, a window. She turned to Lieutenant Vasquez. Bravo element will set an overwatch position on the ridge. 1 marksman. Full ROE applies. She looked up. Mercer. The room went very quiet. Not a dramatic quiet. A waiting quiet. I felt it on the back of my neck like a pressure change before rain. Vasquez nodded. Sarky, actually, was looking at the table. I went back to my cot after the briefing and sat with my hands on my knees for a while. I wasn't scared. That's not the right word for what I was. I was aware, deeply, specifically aware, that there were 12 people in that compound whose lives might intersect with mine in the next 24 hours, and that I was the person who would be making decisions that couldn't be unmade. That the scratch on my rifle stock was going to be present at something that mattered. That my breath, my heartbeat, my biology was about to be load-bearing. Outside, someone was playing music from a phone, something with a lot of bass that bled tinny through the speaker, and somewhere across the FOB, a generator cycled, up with a sound like a dog coughing, and a radio crackled with traffic I wasn't tracking, and none of it felt real against what I was sitting inside of. I thought about my grandfather. Plus, he'd been a hunter. Not a sport hunter, a Depression-era Missouri man who shot what the family ate, and who taught me at 11 years old that a rifle is a conversation you're having with physics, and the physics doesn't care how you feel about it. You either understand ballistics and wind and breath and trigger discipline, or you don't. The deer doesn't care that you're nervous. The deer doesn't care that you're nervous, Rosa. I picked up my rifle and ran a patch through the barrel. Then another. Then I checked the scope 0, even though I'd checked it that morning. Then I sat with it across my knees until Vasquez knocked on the doorframe and said, 0430 Mercer. Get some sleep. I put the rifle down. I didn't sleep. At 0200 TBH, I went outside and sat on an ammo crate by the eastern Hesco wall and looked at the stars. The Kandahar sky at that hour isn't a subtle thing. It's the kind of dark that makes you understand why ancient people thought the universe had an opinion about them. You can feel small under it in a way that is almost not comfortable exactly, but honest. Like it's telling you what's actually true about scale. Private First Class Denny Chu found me there around 0230. He was 20 years old, from Sacramento, and he had the quality of being genuinely kind without being naive about it, which is rarer than people think. Can't sleep either, he said. Nope. He sat, to be fair, on the other ammo crate and looked at the same sky. We didn't talk for a while. The wind was cold and smelled like dust and something faintly chemical from the direction of the motor pool. You nervous about tomorrow? He asked. I thought about lying. Yeah. Good, he said. You should be. Plus, means taking it serious. I looked at him. My dad's a surgeon, he said, like this was a continuation of something. He told me once that the day he stops being nervous before an operation is the day he needs to quit. Because that's, I guess, the day he stopped understanding what he's doing. We sat with that for a bit. Sarky's an idiot, Denny said then, conversationally. TBH, Sarky's scared, I said. Denny looked at me. He's scared I'm going to do the job right, and that's going to mean something about him. I shrugged. People get scared in all kinds of ways. Denny thought about that. That's a generous read. I'm not being generous. I'm just being accurate. He nodded slowly, and you're going to take the shot, he said. Not a question. If pretty much I get one. You're going to take it. The generator across the base cycled again. Somewhere out in the dark, past the wire, something moved, a dog probably, or the wind in dry brush. And we both tensed for half a second before relaxing. Get some sleep, Chew, I said. You too, Mercer. Neither of us moved for another 20 minutes. We moved out at 0430, and the cold hit like something with an agenda. 6 of us in Bravo element. Single file through the gap in the eastern wire into ground that was absolutely black and absolutely quiet in the way that pre-dawn Afghanistan specializes in. A silence that isn't peaceful, just waiting. My boots found rocks I couldn't see. My left knee, which I'd tweaked on a PT run 2 weeks prior, sent up its usual complaint around the half-kilometer mark. I noted it sort of, and ignored it the way you ignore a coworker who's always complaining about the thermostat. Behind me, I could hear Sarky's breathing. He was carrying the spotting scope and a secondary radio, and he was my assigned support for the Overwatch position, which was either someone's idea of a joke or someone's idea of an opportunity, and NT decided which. Lieutenant Vasquez had pulled me aside before we left. Sarky's your support because he's the best spotter and I need the best spotter with a marksman, he said. No priambit. You know, I know there's tension. I need you to put it in a box. It's already in a box, sir. He looked at me for a second. Good. Then, quieter, I put you on this because you're right for it, Mercer. Not because of anything else, and just so you know. I told him I knew. I'm not sure I believed it fully, but I believed him saying it, and sometimes that's enough to operate on. The ridgeline was 2 kilometers northeast, which sounds like a number until you're doing it in the dark over broken terrain with 50 pounds of kit and a rifle that you're keeping off your back because you can't trust your pack frame not to bang the scope. By the time we reached the base of the ridge, I was sweating through my base layer despite the cold, and my left knee had upgraded its complaint from memo to formal grievance. The rock, I guess, face went up about 60 meters, angled enough that you could climb it without gear if you were careful, which we were. Vasquez led the main element around the eastern side of the compound approach. Sarky and I went up. He didn't offer to help, which I didn't ask. The rock was to be fair, good under my hands, rough, grippy, the kind that doesn't crumble unless you trust it too fast. I moved in short sections, testing each hold, keeping my weight low. The rifle was slung across my chest with the muzzle forward, and I had to angle my body sideways for 2 sections where the face got narrow. Sarky was above me for the last 30 feet, already settled into the notch we'd identified on the satellite imagery. A natural shelf in the rock, slightly concave, about 6 feet wide and 2 feet deep, with a clear sight line down to the compound's central courtyard. He had the spotting scope deployed by the time I got there. I didn't say anything. I got into position. The position was good. I mean that technically, the shelf gave me a stable platform, the elevation was right, the angle into the courtyard gave me coverage of the primary approach gate and most of the open ground between the buildings. I estimated range at roughly 440 meters, and wind was light from the northwest, maybe 3 to 5 knots. Dawn was coming. The sky to the east had shifted from black to a deep bruised purple. That meant I'd maybe 40 minutes before first light made our position noticeably more exposed. I settled the rifle and found my natural point of aim. Let my TBH body go loose from the hips down, tight from the shoulders up. Breathed. Sarky had his eye to the scope. His, voice when he spoke was flat and professional, all the theater stripped out of it. That was kind of one thing about him. When the work started, he worked. Compound looks cold. About 1 kind of sentry at the south gate. No movement in the main structure. Copy. 3 vehicles in the courtyard. Kind of 2 trucks, 1 SUV. SUV's got recent tire tracks. Came in last 6 hours. Copy. We settled in. The rock was hard under my elbows and hips. I pulled my focus down to a small, bright point, the front gate, the courtyard, the door of the main structure, and let everything else go peripheral. The cold, plus the knee, the 43-hour deficit of sleep. Pretty much peripheral. Not gone, just not load-bearing. The sky kept lightening. 32 minutes in, Sarky said, "Movement, main structure door." I was already there. A man came out, looked both ways, the practiced look of someone who'd been doing that for years, not paranoid, just habitual, and crossed toward the SUV. Sort of 2 others followed. Plus, they were carrying bags. The bags were the kind of nondescript weight that meant either supplies or documents, and at this point in the operation it didn't matter, because none of them were Nasir. "Negative on the HVT," I said. Confirming negative, Sarky said, and they loaded the bags into the SUV. One of them lit a cigarette. The smoke went straight up in the still morning air. Vasquez's voice, came through my earpiece, barely above a whisper. "Bravo 2, status? 3 packs, not the HVT. Preparing to move TBH, a vehicle. Advise holding. Copy. Hold." I've been in position for 51 minutes when my knee stopped being a formal grievance and became a genuine problem. It wasn't pain exactly. It was the particular stiffness of a joint that's been bent in one position too long against cold rock, which is its own category of discomfort. I pretty much couldn't adjust Any significant movement would shift my position and require me to re-zero, and I didn't have time for that. I flexed my foot slightly, kind of gritted my teeth, went back to the front sight, which you okay? Sarkey asked. I was surprised by the question, and fine. He didn't push it, but he'd asked. Plus, the compound went quiet for 22 minutes. The man with the cigarette finished it and went back inside. The other two disappeared into the secondary structure. The sentry at the south gate changed, a different man, younger, who stood with his rifle held across his body instead of slung, which meant he was either more disciplined or more scared, and from 440 meters I couldn't tell which. Vasquez called in twice. Negative status both times. At minute 74 of the operation, Sarkey said, very quietly, Mercer. I was already adjusting. The main structure door opened, and Mullah Farid Nasir walked into the courtyard. I want to tell you that I knew immediately, and I did, in the way you know a face from a file when you've studied it, I guess, for long enough, but knowing isn't the same as certainty, and certainty is the only currency that matters at this particular junction. I watched him, and he was moving toward the SUV. He had two men flanking him, both armed, both scanning. He was, to be fair, wearing a dark shower camise and a paycall hat, and he was moving with the specific, unhurried purpose of a man who has never in his life had to rush to stay alive. Confirm visual on HVT, I said. Sarkey had the spotting scope. 3 seconds. 4. Confirming HVT. Positive ID. He's at the vehicle. Copy. Vasquez, Bravo 2. We have positive ID on HVT. Courtyard. Moving to primary vehicle. Request authorization. A pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds and felt like a week. Bravo 2. Authorization is green. Your shot. Fun fact, my shot. The phrase landed in my chest like something physical. I want to describe what happens in the body in that moment, but I don't think language is actually adequate to it. It's not fear, though fear is present. It's TBH, not calm, though calm is also present. It's something closer to the moment before you step off a high dive, everything that was abstract becoming suddenly completely concrete. The weight of the rifle, which I'd stopped feeling, returning to my hands. The cold air in my lungs, which the heartbeat I needed to control, that I've been controlling for training purposes for years, suddenly meaning something. Actually, Nasir reached the vehicle. Stopped. Said something to one of the flanking men. He wasn't moving, which clean line. No obstruction. 440 meters. Northwest wind, for knots. I'd calculated the correction already. Held off slightly left. Raised fractionally for the drop. I mean, breathe in, plus breathe out. Find the pause between exhale and the next inhale, that stillness. That perfect stillness that my grandfather told me about beside a muddy Missouri pond when I was 11 years old, and the deer didn't care how I felt about it. The deer doesn't care, Rosa. I found it. I took the shot. The sound comes after. That's the part nobody tells you. The shot, to you, is the recoil, a hard pushback into your shoulder, mechanical, expected, and then the world rearranges itself in the next 1.3 seconds, and then you hear the report catch up with itself, rolling back off the ridgeline, and by then you're already cycling the bolt and acquiring again because training doesn't stop for feelings. HVT is down. Well, Sarkey said. His voice was flat. Factual. Confirmed. The courtyard erupted. Plus, the two flanking men went in opposite directions, one toward the south gate, one dropping behind the SUV, and in the compound's main structure a door banged open hard enough that I could hear it at 440 meters, which meant whatever was behind it hit the wall, and people were shouting in Pashto, 2 voices, 3, and somewhere a vehicle engine turned over. Bravo 2, Bravo 6. Vasquez's voice, sharp and controlled. Where I think, moving on the compound. Can you, in my opinion, cover the east egress? I was already shifting. Covering east egress, confirm. What happened in the next 11 minutes, I will try to describe accurately, because I've been asked to describe it accurately by people with more authority than me, and also because accuracy is the only thing that matters once you're inside an event like that. The man who'd gone toward the south gate made it as far as the gate itself before Vasquez's. element came around the eastern corner of the compound wall, and he turned around and put his hands up. The man behind the SUV didn't put his hands up. He took a position behind the vehicle's engine block and fired 2 rounds toward Vasquez's element, both of which hit the compound wall, neither of which hit anyone. Sarkey called the angles. TBH, plus I watched. The man didn't fire again. He could see his position from multiple angles, and he was doing the math. The math wasn't working out for him, and eventually he put his rifle on the ground and stood up with his hands visible. That was the east egress, which on the west side of the compound, a motorcycle attempted to leave through a gap in the rear wall. Corporal Jimenez, on Vasquez's team, put it down with a single shot to the rear tire. The motorcycle went over. The rider was apprehended. The whole thing was done in 11 minutes and 14 seconds, according to Vasquez's radio log, which I later read in the incident report. We came down off the ridge when Vasquez called the all clear. My knee buckled slightly on the descent. Not badly, just the protest of a joint that had been locked in one position for 92 minutes against cold rock, and had opinions about that. I caught myself on the rock face and kept moving. Sarkey was ahead of me, which about halfway down he stopped, turned, and extended a hand back. I looked at the hand, and your knee, he said. I sort of saw you favoring it. I took the hand. He steadied me for the last 15 feet, then let go, and we didn't say anything about it. And we haven't said anything about it since, and I think that's the right way for it to have gone. The compound, was a different kind of quiet when we walked in. The kind that settles after action, not before it. Soldiers moving through rooms with the specific efficiency of people who have been trained to clear spaces, calling clear, clear, clear down the hallways, and the smell of the place coming up now. That I was inside it, cooking smoke and engine oil and something sharp that might have been fear, though I know that's not chemically accurate, and I'm describing something psychological rather than physiological. Vasquez was in the courtyard. He looked to be fair at me when I walked in, and something crossed his face that I still can't fully name, not pride exactly, or at least not just pride. Something more complicated, like relief, maybe with some other things underneath it. Good work, Mercer. Thank you, sir. He nodded toward the main structure. Get water. We'll be here a while for SSC. I went and got water. The sensitive site exploitation took 3 hours, and I stayed on a modified security position, which meant I sat on an overturned crate in the courtyard with my rifle across my knees and watched the approaches while the intelligence people did their work inside. The sun was fully up by then, and the Kandahar Basin was delivering on its promise of cooking you slowly from above, and somewhere in the far distance I could hear what might have been a vehicle or might have been a shepherd moving his flock. Sound travel strange in that terrain, and a radio at the far end of the compound was playing something I couldn't identify. Denny Chu came and sat near me around an hour or two. You doing okay? He asked. I thought about the question honestly. Working on it. He nodded, and that's the right answer. We sat. I watched the eastern approach. The sun continued its agenda. For what it's worth, Denny said, nobody's saying the thing they were saying before. I knew what he meant. I didn't answer right away, and they don't have to say anything. I said finally, I know. He handed me part of a protein bar he'd been eating, broke it off without asking. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I ate the protein bar piece. It tasted like chalk and artificial chocolate, which is the truest taste of deployed life that I know, and somehow it was exactly what I needed. Sarkey, to be fair, found me before we exfilled. He came and stood near me, not too close, but not at the social distance he'd been maintaining for 3 weeks, and he looked at the compound wall for a while rather than at me, which I understood and respected. 440 meters, he said. 42, I said. I measured it after. He nodded slowly, which northwest wind at what? 3 knots. I did at 4. 3 to 4, he said. Good call and hold off. Thank you. Another pause. He was still looking at the wall. I do wrong, he said. Not an apology, exactly, and more like a statement of fact delivered with the same flatness he used for range calls. I know, I said. That's on me. Yes, I said. It is. He nodded once, looked at me briefly, then walked away. And that was that. Not a transformation, not a cinematic moment of redemption, just a man updating his understanding of something he'd gotten wrong and doing it out loud so I knew, and then moving on, which is actually more than I'd expected and maybe more than he owed, and I filed it in the column marked complete. Weeks filled at 1340. The walk back was different than the walk out. Same terrain, actually same weight, same left knee with its manifesto of grievances. But the light was different, full midday white rather than pre-dawn black, and I could see the ground under my boots, which makes everything feel different even when nothing has actually changed. You can see where you're putting your feet. That matters. I was near the back of the file. Vasquez was up front. Between us, 11 people moving through a scene that was ancient and indifferent and beautiful in the way of things that have no opinion about you. I thought about my grandfather again, and not the hunting lesson, the other memory, the earlier one, of him sitting on the porch of his house in Missouri in the last year of his life, when I was 16, and me asking him if he ever regretted any of the things he'd done. He'd looked at the yard for a long time. Regret the things I didn't do because I was scared, he said. Everything else I can sit with. Hadn't he known what he meant then? I was getting a fuller picture now. 3 days after the operation, someone taped a photograph to the front of my locker. It was a printed out image from the debrief documentation, an aerial shot of the compound, time-stamped from the Overwatch period, showing the ridgeline and a tiny indication of our position up there, just barely visible if you knew what you were looking for. Beneath it, in black marker, someone had written, 440 meters. No signature. I left it there. The thing about being the person who gets looked at sideways is that it never fully goes away. I don't mean by those specific individuals. Sarkey had updated his file on me, and whatever adjustment he'd made seemed durable and genuine, and the 11 looks I'd gotten on my first day had gradually, over the weeks that followed, converted to the neutral baseline of professional acknowledgement that was all I'd ever wanted. What I mean is that you carry the memory of it. It changes the way you hold yourself in rooms. It makes you a little quieter and a little harder than you might have been otherwise, and that has costs and benefits in roughly equal proportion. I've been quieter than my nature longer than I could remember. My nature, actually, if I'm being honest about it, was actually the opposite of quiet. I'd been loud and opinionated and enthusiastic about things with an intensity that my mother called a lot and my grandfather called good, and most of the boys I'd grown up around had found somewhere between exhausting and threatening. I'd learned early to sand the edges off, to take up less space, to honestly do the work and trust the results and not make noise about either. I was still learning when to sand and when not to. I wasn't done with that lesson. Captain Okafor called me in for an after-action debrief 4 days post-operation. Kind of standard procedure. She had a notepad and a specific way of asking questions that was neither warm nor cold, purely functional, which I respected enormously. We went through the operation beat by beat. I answered what I was asked, which she wrote what she needed to write. At the end, actually, she capped her pen and looked at me. "How are you processing it?" she asked. I was slightly surprised. "Mom, the shot, the decision. How are you doing with it?" I thought about giving her the short answer. "Fine, ma'am, processing is complete," and didn't. "I'm working through it. I know the ROE was clean. I know the ID was confirmed. I know the intelligence was solid." I paused. "I still think about it." She nodded, and good. "Mom, the day you stop thinking about it's the day I stopped trusting you with the rifle." She opened a folder, which I understood meant we were done. "You did your job. Now do the harder part." "Harder part, ma'am?" She looked up. "Living with having done your job. There's a particular kind of night that comes about a week after something significant, when the debrief is done and the reports are filed and the operation has a formal designation in someone's record somewhere, and your body finally realizes it's allowed to stop being at operational readiness. That night, for me, was a Wednesday. Plus, I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling of the tent, and the generator did its coughing thing, and someone 2 cots over was snoring with the complete commitment of a man who has made peace with his own existence. and the wind came off the basin cold and smelling of dust, and that faint chemical ghost from the motor pool, and I thought about a compound 440 meters away that I'd never go back to. About a man I'd never met who'd made choices over a long career that ended on a particular morning. About a grandfather in Missouri who'd told me the only thing you can sit with is the thing you did when you haven't done it. I thought about the white scratch on my rifle stock, about the 11,000 hours I'd put into being exactly good enough at a thing that mattered, about what my mother would say back home if I tried to explain any of this. She tried to understand the way she always tried, which is a kind of love even when it falls short. About Denny Chew and the chocolate chop protein bar, and the way some people are just constitutionally kind reliably in all conditions, and how rare that is, and how much it costs a person, and how they mostly don't know what it costs. About Sarkey and the hand on the rock face, and the flat voice saying I do wrong in exactly the same register he used to call wind speed. In my opinion, I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that. Not because crying would be wrong. It wouldn't have been, but because it's accurate. What kind of was happening was something quieter than crying. Something in the neighborhood of reckoning, the word my grandfather used when he was describing what happened when you finally had to look at a thing honestly instead of sideways. Reckoning. I took my braid down that night for the first time in 3 weeks. Not for any reason, which not as a symbol. Just pretty much because it had been giving me a headache, and I'd been tolerating the headache as part of the cost of keeping the braid, and I was tired of paying costs for their own sake. My hair, unbound, is genuinely ridiculous. It's the kind of red that is almost aggressive, not auburn, not strawberry, but actually sincerely, biblically red, and it's the texture of something that has never once in its life taken an instruction about direction. I wore it to my shoulders, and it did what it wanted. I sat up on my cot with my hair down, and my rifle propped against the tent pole, and the generator coughing somewhere outside, and just existed for a few minutes in a version of myself that wasn't performing any kind of management. It felt like unclenching a fist I'd forgotten I was making. The next morning at 0500, I ran my 4 miles. At 0547, coming in through the east entrance of the FOB, I passed Sarkey going out toward the motor pool carrying a radio in one hand and a coffee cup that was much too small for the size of the man in the other, and he looked up and saw me, hair still down, red and unruly in the early light, and he stopped for just a second. He didn't say anything. In my opinion, I didn't say anything. He kept walking, but the look on his face before he looked away, I saw it, and I cataloged it, not as a victory, but as information. The kind of information that tells you where you actually stand past whatever has been performed in either direction. He saw me, and I've been asked in the years since what I'd say to younger soldiers about being doubted, about walking into rooms where people have already decided what you're. I think about it honestly when people ask. I don't say ignore them, because you can't, not fully, and pretending you can is its own kind of damage. What you're really doing is learning to metabolize the doubt without letting it set the terms of your operation. To hear, I guess, it, and note it, and then go clean your rifle anyway. To run your miles, which to find the stillness between exhale and the next inhale when nothing matters except the physics of the thing in your hands. I don't say prove yourself, because that language hands control of your effort to someone else's scale. You're not proving yourself to them. You're doing the work because the work deserves to be done right, and you're the one who has to live inside your capability either way. What I say is find the scratch and find the small physical mark that is yours, the worn grip, the faded patch, the boot that laces one notch different from the right, and when the room gets loud with other people's doubts about you, put your thumb on that mark and remember the 1,000 hours that put it there. The doubt is about their fear, which the scratch is about your work. Only one of those is real in any way that matters. I was, I guess, at FOB Kestrel for 4 more months after the Nasir operation. In that time, I took 2 additional Overwatch positions, both quieter, no shots fired, and spent 6 weeks training a junior enlisted soldier named Reyes on basic marksman fundamentals, which was one of the best things I did on that deployment because Reyes was genuinely talented and also scared of it, the way talented young people often are, and helping someone stop being scared of what they're capable of is its own particular satisfaction. Sarky, sort of, and I never became friends, which we became something else, a functional professional respect with clear edges and no pretense of warmth, and that is exactly the right kind of relationship for what we were, and I don't carry any grief about the warmth that isn't there. Denichu wrote me a letter when I rotated back stateside. Just a single page on notebook paper with his handwriting that looked like it belonged to a much older man. He said he honestly was glad to have served with me. He said he'd been telling the story about the surgeon to everyone he knew, and they were all tired of hearing it. He said Sacramento missed him in ways that were specific and verifiable, namely that the Sacramento Kings were still bad, and he was the only one who cared properly about that. I wrote back. I told him pretty much I was glad too. I told him the Kings had made a decent draft pick that year, which I'd no opinion about personally, but I'd read it somewhere, and thought he'd want to know. FOB Kestrel exists, officially, as a grid coordinate in a database someone maintains somewhere. The compound 2 kilometers northeast is the same. It has a file number. Plus, Adat. My name in a small field under Overwatch Marksman. What doesn't have a file number is the cold rock against my elbows at 0600 on a March morning. The specific purple of the sky lightning over the eastern horizon. The scratch on the rifle stock under my thumb. Sarky's voice saying 3 to 4, flat and precise, the way some people express respect. My grandfather's porch in Missouri, which the way the light came through the trees in a way that was specific to that time of day and that latitude and no other. Regret the things you didn't do because you were scared. Everything else you can sit with. I think about those words sometimes, lying in beds that aren't cots, in places that aren't deserts, in the years that have kept moving since then. I check them against my inventory of regrets, and I find, each time, that they're still accurate, still load-bearing. I was scared. I went anyway. I took the shot. Plus, everything else I can sit with.